not digital. It is a continuous modulation at varying amplitudes. In case of frequency modulation, the amplitude is constant, but you, shall we say, cause a deviation or variation in frequency in accordance with the modulation that you want to impress on it. But it is continuous. Now, the idea which von Neumann had, and which he wished to do, and he did do, was that instead of it being continuous radiation, it would be pulsed at about a 10% duty cycle. And this meant he was going to pulse not only the magnetic fields, but he was going to pulse the RF fields, more efficient in his view. Now, Neumann was a strange man, I might add. He was not only a very good theoretician mathematically, he was one of those very rare breed who could convert it to engineering hardware and design the hardware himself. Very few people had that capability. You think of mathematicians like Hilbert, like many others in history, Einstein. Einstein probably couldn't tell you which end of a wrench to hold. When it came to mathematical equations, he had little or no peer. Von Neumann was probably equally as capable in some areas of mathematics, but he had the additional expertise of being a good engineer. He decided it had to be a pulse system, and he needed much time to redesign. He also decided that, unlike trying to lash equipment on the decks of a battleship, he wanted a ship from the ground up, designed for the project. So we went to the Newark shipbuilding yards, not too far away, and took a number off the drawing board, DE-173, and decided that this is what I want done. The Navy concurred, told the builders, we're going to change the design slightly here. We want number 2 gun turret left unfinished. We want a quite large area in the hold of the ship which is left open. We're not going to have all of the usual compartments. Of course, the main machinery had to be functional. The ship had to be able to go to sea. Excuse me. And you will build the ship this way, run it down the ways with the unfinished section in the interior on the unfinished gun turret number 2. But you can provide a dummy gun turret if you wish to cover up the hole. In fact, if it's going to go to sea, you'll have to. Well, that ship was on the ways in the summer of '42, and I'm talking about DE-173. The official Navy record shows, if you care to look it up, that it was commissioned in August 27th, 1943, and it went down the ways about 2 months before that. And it was in construction in 1943, not 1942. I'm speaking, of course, of the official record. The Navy does not and never has denied the existence of DE-173. It has only denied the much earlier date of launch and of its use in the Philadelphia experiment. To this day, they insist there never was a Philadelphia experiment. Well, I've got news for them. There was, and I was there, as were. Let me give you a picture of, shall we say, what our daily work was like. We reported in every day. We didn't live on the base, Duncan and I. We reported in every day, typically around 7 in the morning, through the main gate. It was interesting to note, and anybody can check the old maps on this, there's an old trolley line that may to this day be running on Broad Street, which went right through downtown Philadelphia and straight and directly to the Navy base. In fact, at one point it ran on the base, but they cut it off eventually right at the entrance, or the entrance gate, and you walked from there. Direct trolley line, no problems getting back and forth. And we lived off base. And of course, actually, we shuttled back and forth between the Institute and the Philadelphia Navy Yard. We come in the morning, we go to work, and our job there in the yard was really more supervisory than anything. We were not involved in design. We were not actually part of building equipment or moving equipment on board. We were supervisory. But we had to know everything that was happening. We had to know everything that was being done. And watch, literally, the equipment that was installed. After the Eldridge was actually launched in September of 1942, I was transferred to the Philadelphia Navy Yard, and the finishing work was done on the ship there in the Navy Yard. And this, of course, included, as time went on, the installation of some very heavy equipment on board the ship. The ship's power was totally inadequate for supplying the power necessary for these tests because we were using megawatts of power as equipment was designed. We had an 8 megawatt diesel electric generator, which was the biggest piece of equipment to be moved in the hold. That took a lot of work. Then there was a pair of alternators, 75 kVA each, with a huge motor drive system and gearboxes. They had to be rolled and bolted into place very securely. And then some additional work was done by another man I've talked with since, is Al Bilek, because he is still alive, last I heard, and he designed the synchronizing equipment, which became a real problem because von Neumann knew, and without going into the specifics of the theory, the two alternators had to be electrically synchronized in an exact phase relationship. And that could not be done mechanically. It was tried, but it was a totally hopeless task because you're dealing with huge gearboxes and 75 horsepower motor, and all of the adjacent gearboxes and other systems, and there was always mechanical slop. Finally, it had to be done as an electrical synchronization directly between the two alternators. That was accomplished. It took a lot of work. Like so many other pieces of equipment on board that ship, you put them in, you test a particular system, a particular piece of equipment. There were all kinds of failures, all kinds of frustrations, and everybody took it out, their frustrations, that is, typically that night in one of the downtown bars in Philadelphia. The Blue Lagoon, to be specific. That bar was mentioned in the movie, the commercial movie of the Philadelphia Experiment, titled The Philadelphia Experiment, produced in 1984, but they never mentioned the name of the bar. The scenario they showed in there was essentially correct. The bar, in fact, existed far beyond the period of 1943. It was finally shut down, I understand, about 1993, which is quite a few years. As I remember it, and Duncan remembers it, because we usually went together, unless we were on dates or something. We'd go down there and have a beer or two or three with the boys, and that is the sailors who were non-coms or had no rating, whatever. It was rather an interesting group because we stuck rather closely together. We had to for a reason. We were all under orders not to talk about the experiment. Now, people would ask us in those days, what are you doing? You're in the yard? Yes. What are you doing? Well, we're working on a project. Well, what are you working on? Well, we couldn't talk about it. And we beat around the bush, and occasionally there was a little leakage and reprimands. But basically, people kept their mouths shut and just said, we were working on a war project. That was the password at those times. Nobody asked much more. So time went on, became very familiar with the bar. And of course, the night before the final test, there was a sort of farewell party. And I say the final test of the Eldridge. Actually, I'm talking about test number 2. Even before test number 1 for the Eldridge, there was a sort of going away party. But the whole process of getting the equipment ready took months and months and months. It went on from December, when they took the Eldridge out of dry dock finally, where they put in the very heavy equipment and did the finishing work on the ship, which was December of 42, and put it in the back section of the Navy Yard where all of the other equipments were put on, and there were subsection tests and various pieces of equipment were tested. The radio communication system was tested. And they made their final assignments of personnel. And the crew, I might add, was a specially selected volunteer crew. Now that gets to another interesting part of the history. Before I go into that, I just want to say that with all of the frustration of all of these tests, we finally decided the ship was ready for testing. And von Neumann conceded it was ready for testing sometime in early July of 1943. And this test, the first one, was conducted on 22 July 43, about 6 miles downriver from the yard itself in the river. Not where it became already the bay, the Delaware Bay. It was up near actually part of the city, at an island called Tinicum Island. They did not drop anchor. This, of course, was not to be done because nobody knew what would happen to these fields if you dropped anchor. It might short them out. So no anchor was dropped. It was put on station, became stationary, and equipment was turned on. The results I will describe shortly. But that only came on 22 July. There was a lot of grief and work to be done in the interim. When we were all satisfied it would work, and Tesla said long since, you're going to have problems with the high power, von Neumann agreed eventually, with a lot of argumentation between Duncan, myself, and von Neumann. Tesla said so, and you'd want to hear this, but eventually he agreed there is a possibility, because we were dealing with some rather high powers. Now, what kind of power were we dealing with? Von Neumann decided to up the power output of the RF transmitters from the original half-megawatt design to each antenna to a 2-megawatt design, and this is operating at 160 megahertz. Now, some people may feel that frequency was impossible in those days with the kind of power we're using. Never forget the fact that military electronics and government electronic systems are always years, decades typically ahead of the civilian sector. Now, in the period of time of then, let's say a more reasonable statement would be perhaps 30 years ahead. Today, the secret electronics and other systems which our government has are probably anywhere from 50 to 100 years ahead of what the civilian population knows, and the commercial population and the commercial usage knows. But we were ahead. We had the capability of producing that kind of power, obviously, for military usage and for the government. The various manufacturing companies will produce equipment on special order, which is not for commercial usage. The theory is there, it's just a matter of can you build it? Well, if they say we offer you this amount of money, get it built, they do it. And there was no limit, because the war was already on. There was no limit on the money that was expended to just get the job done. And why were they so anxious to get it done? Well, historically, for those who are not aware of it today, in this era, when the war started, the Germans had huge fleets of submarines. They were very effective at sinking shipping. In fact, they were so effective they almost cut England off from food. They sank every other piece of shipping coming across the Atlantic or from wherever heading to England. Up until December 7th, 1941, of course, the U.S. was not involved, and U.S. shipping was theoretically immune from being sunk. Comes December 7th, with the attack in Pearl Harbor, we were part of the war, and of course we were just as vulnerable as anyone else. With 50% of the shipping going down in the Atlantic, it was quite a problem. They wanted, of course, to reduce this as much as possible, and to get shipping, munitions, food, whatever, through to England. And the idea of the whole basic concept of invisibility was that if you can make the ship invisible to radar, the Germans had good radar. They won't be able to find the convoys and the ships and the fleet except by day, and if the ships, the submarines, are seen by day, there are means of taking care of them. If they're on the surface or even have a periscope up, they can spot them, and torpedoes or whatever will take care of them. If the convoy is invisible to radar, they're not even going to be able to find the general location by radar, and they'll probably miss most of the convoys. That was the hope, and that was the idea, and why so much time and money was spent on the Project Invisibility. In the background, but just a little bit after this, not concurrent, was another major war effort, of course, the atomic bomb. That work started or about 1942. The theory, of course, was laid down much earlier. But the work on that was totally separate and began in Los Alamos laboratories in 1943. I will go into that in a little later because I was part of that. The concern was, how do you stop these Wolfpack fleets from being so effective? Invisibility seemed to be the answer if it worked properly. So with all of the work and the effort, and having our little farewell party on the night of July 21, the test crew was on the Eldridge, was taken downriver, and on the orders from the observer ship and the man who was in charge of this whole test for the Navy, let's say the official coordinator running all these tests, was a man by the name of Captain Harrison. Harrison was a very interesting man in his own way. He was the first Native American to achieve the rank of captain in the U.S. Navy. And it was sort of an honor for him to do this. I know this because I know his son, who's currently alive today. And he was in charge of the tests. Well, of course, on this carrier, which was used for the observing of the tests, they wanted to be high enough above the water so that it was very easy to see what was going on through binoculars. And also see the other very important aspect of this test is it wasn't just the ship that became invisible. This donut field was surrounding the ship but did not impinge on the hull of the ship. It was a little bit outside of it. As a result of this, water also became invisible. There was a water line around the ship which showed essentially the outline of where the ship would be, except the water line was a little larger than the ship. So from the observing ship high enough up, you could see what this water line was and tell where the ship was. Hopefully it was really there. It was, in fact. And observe this. Well, Harrison looked at this, and after about 20 minutes of the test, he could see that something did not appear to be quite correct, and something in his mind bugged him. Namely, if the ship is sitting there invisible, and we can't see the water under the ship and so forth, is this ship really in water or is it in air? This is what bothered him. It says terminate the tests after 20 minutes. And they were terminated. The ship became visible. It was totally invisible to sight, not to radar, which they did test for, because 43 already had good radar systems. Told to return to the yard, which it did, back in the back section, and then we knew there was a problem, because all those sailors were deliberately stationed on deck to be observers of what they could see from inside, i.e., could you see anything outside the ship? No, nothing. Gray field, gray fog, thick gray impenetrable fog, but everything on board the ship appeared to be normal, within the purview of up to the rail. But those who were on the decks became very sick, very nauseous, totally out of it mentally. They weren't injured physically, but they were totally, shall we say, incapacitated mentally. So Von Neumann sees this when they get back and says to the Navy, we got a problem. I've got to find some solution to this. The Navy says, not to worry, we have another test crew for you. About half of the volunteer crew was used on the first test, and the second half was used on the second test. To get into that aspect of the volunteer crew, where did this come from and how did this occur? So I mentioned previously my father, who left the Navy in December of 1929, unbeknownst to us at that time, was not only building racing sloops in Long Island and putting them in the racing regattas, but he was also, as I already mentioned, bringing some German scientists out of Germany. Why was he doing this? What were his connections? What else was going on? It took many, many years, long after I was no longer at Cameron, and when I was Al Bielek, to find the answers to what Father was really doing and what he was involved in. That I'll get into later, other than to say at this point that he was doing many things we weren't quite aware of. Now, what is of record in that period was that when the war started, the Coast Guard tapped him on the shoulder and asked him if he would give volunteer service to the Coast Guard. He did. There are pictures of him in his Coast Guard uniform at the age of 50. He's still a very good-looking man. And he became literally the man who is the, shall we say, the schoolmaster for the special volunteer crew. The Navy went as von Neumann wanted, not only a special ship, he wanted a volunteer crew, which the Navy agreed was a very good idea, because nobody knew what might really happen. And Tesla let it be known that some things might happen. He went throughout the whole Navy and asked for volunteers for a very special project. These were the requirements. You had to have at least a normal IQ, you had to be in good health, and so forth. And if you volunteered, you would be taken out of your present billet and be put on some other special project. You go through a special school and all of this. They got a number of volunteers and eventually selected and settled on some 33. They went through a special training class between September and December of 1942 at one of the Coast Guard facilities in Connecticut. And Father was the one who briefed them. And I have in my collection a picture of this test crew. And it's very interesting because they were in a gymnasium when they took the picture. In the middle, and seated in the first row, was my father. This became the backbone. They, of course, when they finished their schooling in December of 42, they became the backbone of the crew, the enlisted crew, for the tests. There were, of course, some officers in addition. These people stood by, quite literally, in the Philadelphia Navy Yard during the period from January of 43 until they were required on the Eldridge, with some training on board ship, of course. And then, of course, we had the first test on July 22nd, 1943. To the radar systems, the ship was invisible. To those optically viewing it, the ship was invisible. It just faded out, if you will. According to what I was told, not being on the outside, but on the inside with Duncan running the equipment, it just sort of faded out from view like some of the modern fade-out montages they do in television and in the movies, which they're expert at creating these effects now. But this was a real effect, not an illusion. It was an illusion in the sense that you couldn't see the ship anymore, but it was very much there. But it had a price, and the price was what happened to the crew on deck. Those below deck were shielded by the steel and not affected. So Von Neumann looks at this and says, we got to solve this problem. He went to the Navy and says, I need time to solve it. The Navy didn't give him an answer at first. Finally, they came back to him about August 1 and said, you have a drop-dead date. You complete these tests by 12 August 1943 or forget it. Now, this was very unusual because von Neumann didn't understand this. Duncan and I didn't understand it. I went to Hal Bourne Sr., who was still available, director of the Office of Naval Engineering. We had some friendship with him. And asked him, what is this all about? He says, well, I got the order. It comes from upstairs, and he says, I'll look into it. And he came back in a rather short time. He says, this originated with Admiral King, who at that point was the Chief of Naval Operations worldwide. Now, what is a man, as I asked, and Hal Bourne couldn't understand it, why is a Navy admiral running all of the Navy's affairs in the war out of Washington concerned about a date on an engineering test and having it end on 12 August? Or be completed by 12 August, or, quote, forget it, unquote. We didn't understand this, and frankly, we never got the answer to what this was all about till quite literally the late 1980s. No longer I was like Ed Cameron. Physically I am, but my identity today is Al Bielek. And with a lot of research, we did find the answer, but I'll not get into that at this point. That is quite a bit of explaining as to what that was really all about. Von Neumann didn't understand it. Nobody did, but we had the date. We had to live with it. So it was around the clock.